development is all about hypothesis testing. A/B testing is all about hypothesis testing. I use this term really broadly to cover all types of experimentation. So for example, usability studies, I believe, are experiments. Anytime where there's something that you're trying to learn something, we'll get into this. And really what's going on here is that we are in the middle of a giant mindset shift across the entire internet industry, where, now I say product and UX, but I really mean anybody who builds internet products. So if you're a founder, if you're a data scientist, if you're an engineer, I include you in this. We're going through this shift where we used to think that we could sit in a room and have all the answers. And now we realize, hey, this stuff's pretty hard, and understanding how people behave is pretty hard. So maybe we should run some experiments to figure it out. And I actually think this is the most important thing that's happened since the beginning of the internet in terms of us getting good at what we do. And I'm glad we're at a Lean Meetup, because I think the Lean Startup took us in a giant step in the right direction. So let's talk about this mindset shift. The old way was, we sat in a room and we came up with 10 things to build, and we built them. And then after we put them into production, maybe we measured what was happening. We realized that only 3 of them worked. Maybe we didn't even realize that because we weren't measuring anything. But assuming that we were, we realized that, hey, only 3 of our ideas actually worked. And the challenge is we probably didn't remove the 7 things that didn't. And we probably didn't detach ourselves from the 7 things that didn't. We just let them stay there. And we started to incur a lot of technical debt, and we maintained code that wasn't helping our users, and our user experience got worse and worse. And the new way is actually much simpler. The new way is, let's just run 10 experiments and only build the 3 things that actually work. And this is a critical distinction, because I find, so a lot of my work as a consultant and a coach is I'm working with teams that are trying to adopt Lean practices. And what they find is that putting Lean into practice, actually doing it, is really hard. It's a giant mindset shift. And what a lot of teams are doing is they're going ahead and building, and then they're measuring, and then they're learning, because that's the Lean loop, right? But the value of experimentation is to experiment before you build, and to save those engineering resources. And really to figure out how do you run really simple tests to get the answers that you need so that you only build the 3 things that are going to work. Okay. So there's only one problem with this shift towards experimentation, and that's that a lot of companies are wasting a ton of time, a ton of man hours, and a number of sprints on experiments that just don't matter, right? I'm sure for those of you that are started with experimentation, you're running into this where you run A/B test after A/B test, and you're not getting a winner, or the difference is not very significant. Or you run usability test after usability test, you go, oh, that was neat, and it never gets integrated into your product development process. And a lot of this is not because it's not because these methods don't work. It's because as a profession, we have to get better at thinking like scientists. So most of us, if we weren't, say, biology or chemistry or physics majors as undergrads, probably haven't designed an experiment in the truest sense, like in the science sense. As in starting with a hypothesis and a null hypothesis and designing an experiment to understand what's true. Maybe if you were in the 5th grade science fair, you came up with a really simple experiment. But now, let's fast forward, we're all adults, we have to do this for a living. It's actually really hard. So my goal in this talk is to talk about what can we do to get the most out of our experiments. We're not scientists, we're product managers and designers, and maybe our data analysts are the closest, but I've seen lots of data analysts make some of these mistakes. So I really think that we all need to become scientists and get good at this stuff. So let's talk about what that looks like. The first thing is, and this is, I think, really grounded in Lean principles, is it's really hard to run a good experiment if you don't know what you need to learn. And this is where I really wish the Lean cycle started with learn. Because we can learn a lot before we build. We probably have to build before we measure, but I'm going to talk about building in a way that isn't your production code. It's where we get into the true nature of MVP and quick and dirty tests. But really, a lot of my work, I ask people over and over and over again, let's back up. What are you trying to learn? How does this experiment actually help you learn that? And there's a couple reasons why this is so critical. So first of all, there's a natural inclination when you first adopt lean that this means test everything. Let's just throw spaghetti at the wall. You've probably heard about this. Google tested 51 shades of blue, and Yahoo tested 30 logos. Is anybody here from Google or Yahoo? All right, well, I wanted to ask why you ran those tests. Because we're going to talk about why they probably weren't very good tests and why they probably didn't learn very much from them. And this is the danger of an experimentation culture. You can go way overboard, and I'm sure you've all had those debates of should the button be red or should it be green. And in the old days, we argued about whose opinion was better, and now we say, let's just test it. This is actually leads to a big waste of time. So I'm a big fan of experimentation. I think it should be a part of our product development process, but we need to be really smart about what we test and when. So we'll get into that. And then this is something that I find is really helpful in terms of trying to identify what it is that you're trying to learn with your experiment. So oftentimes, let's say you're working on a landing page. We didn't have a whole lot of marketing folks, but let's say a sign-up flow. You've got your home page, you've got your value proposition clearly stated on your home page, and you're trying to get people to sign up for your service. You could imagine your designer comes up with 3 good designs for the home page, and you want to know which one is better. You're going to throw them up there, split test them, and see which one is the winner. That's the lean way to go, right? The problem is, what if one of them is worse than the other? What can you conclude? Can you conclude that the one that performed worse is actually worse? This is where the levels of product analysis really come into play. So I'm just going to walk through them really quickly. You can test what's the value proposition. Another way to think about value proposition is what problem are you solving and is it worth solving? So maybe that message on your homepage is communicating some benefits of your product, but your audience doesn't actually care about those things. That could be impacting which one is the winner, right? Then there's the feature level. The feature level is how are we actually going to deliver on this value proposition. So I met a couple people tonight who are working on photo apps. Maybe the value proposition of photo apps is I have 2,000 vacation photos and I don't want to go through them one by one. So I want somebody to help me process my photos really fast. That's a value. Now there's the how. How are you actually going to help me do that? That's sort of the feature level. Now, one of the guys that I was talking to was talking about big data behind that and automatically identifying which of my photos is good. In another case, we're talking about a photo editor with a whole different audience, right? So this is where the value and the features are interconnected. Then below the feature is the design. Now, there's a lot of controversy around what's product, what's design. When I say design here, I don't mean UX in the like people label turf war sense. I just mean you have a feature, you know you want to build it, what does the actual user interface look like? And maybe that's a user experience person doing it, maybe they're working at the feature level. And that's where, let's say that you are building a photo editor, you know that's the feature that you want to offer that's going to deliver on your value. There's obviously dozens and dozens of designs that could implement that feature. Some of them are going to perform better than others. And then finally, the last layer is feasibility. Okay, so you've identified the best solution. Can we actually deliver this? Do we have the technical ability to do that? Now, these 4 questions, every idea that you have, you can run an experiment to answer each of these questions. So when going back to our homepage example, if I run version A versus version B and version B loses, I might conclude my sign-up form isn't very usable, but I don't know that unless it was a design test. It might be that my value proposition didn't resonate. It might be that my implementation was terrible and the homepage took 10 seconds to load. That'd be more of a feasibility issue. So this is where it's really, anytime you're running a test, you want to think about, what do I know? Am I confident in the value proposition? Am I confident this is the right feature? Am I confident this is the right design? Am I confident it's feasible? And which of those am I actually testing? We're going to come back to this at the very end because it's also going to impact the conclusions you can draw from your experiments. And just a quick note, because I see a lot of you taking notes, which I absolutely love. It makes me feel super special. I will make these slides available after the talk, and a lot of this content is also on my blog, and I'll point you to that direction, in that direction as well. Okay, so the second tip that I have for you is to always start with a hypothesis that's testable. Now, it's really easy to just integrate into your language. Well, my hypothesis is that this is better. Okay, that's not a testable hypothesis, right? So what do I mean by a testable hypothesis? A hypothesis by definition is something that can be supported or refuted by an experiment. Now I'm going to take a little side tangent, and I want you to notice the words that I picked. Supported or refuted. Oftentimes people talk about validating and invalidating hypotheses. We have got to move away from this language because it starts with this assumption that things are certain and that we can identify these truths, and as soon as we validate a hypothesis, we're off to the races building products. That's not true, right? So we live in a world of uncertainty. Things are always going to change. One test that fails today might pass tomorrow. All we're doing is we're building evidence. This is going to be really important because this is the difference between being data-driven and being data-informed. So in one case, you're going to do whatever the data tells you because you're not a human. You could just be a machine doing your job. And in another case, you're using data as an input to make better product decisions. And in this situation, I would really encourage you to change your language around this. Your hypothesis is not telling you which direction to go. It's building support for your direction, or it's refuting your direction. This is all part of starting to think like a scientist, by the way. This is how we, as product managers and designers and engineers, can put on our scientist hats. A lot of it comes around to the language that we use and how we think about what we're learning from our experiments. Okay, so what do I mean by a good hypothesis or a testable hypothesis? A good hypothesis, in my mind, includes 5 key elements. And the reason why I identify these 5 key elements is I find that when people go through the effort to define all 5 of these, their experiments become much better. They draw much better conclusions from them. They're less susceptible to false positives. We'll get into that a little bit later. So what are these 5 things? The first one is the obvious one. Almost every hypothesis I've ever heard includes this one. It's the change that we're trying to make. So my hypothesis is that this design is better. This design is the change, right? So even before I put on my scientist hat and I've just adopted the language and I'm interacting with my team, and I just say, this design is better. This is the change that I want to make. This new sign-up flow, this new onboarding process, this new email subscription page, whatever it is the change that you're making. The second component is the expected impact that you expect that change to have. So we started with this design is better. Okay, so expected impact is better. I'm going to push on you to make that specific and measurable. So what better isn't very specific, and it's certainly not measurable. So maybe a design will increase the conversion rate. Maybe it will increase signups. Maybe it will increase customer satisfaction, right? So your expected impact should be something very specific that you can measure. We'll come back to this as well. The third one is for who. So oftentimes we think that our product changes will affect everybody, but in reality, we're rarely building something for everybody. And I don't mean this just at the value proposition level. This photo guy is different from the photo guy over there, totally different audiences. I don't even mean it at that level. I mean it at the level of, let's see, so I was working with somebody on an experiment where they, as you were leaving their page, they wanted to put up a pop-up that said, hey, subscribe to my email list. Most blogs do this, you've probably seen it. You're reading an article, get to the bottom of the page, and it says, hey, did you love that article? Subscribe. And she wanted to test whether or not people would subscribe. She thought it was a low-risk test. They weren't subscribing as it was. Add the pop-up, will they subscribe? The problem is, she ran the test on her entire population. She didn't define her who. The problem with running it with the entire population is that some of her readers are already subscribers. They're always going to say no to that pop-up because they've already subscribed. So this is a really key point, because if out of 100 readers, 80 of them are already subscribers, and 1 out of the remaining 20 subscribe, it's going to look like her conversion rate is 5%, 1 out of 100. But in reality, it's 1 out of 20, which is a much better conversion rate, right? So this is where the who you're testing with becomes really critically important. The fourth one is by how much, and I really owe this to the book Lean Analytics. This book, if you haven't read it, it's probably my favorite in the Lean series, after the Lean Startup itself. Nothing against running Lean, also a fantastic book. And it just does a really good job of breaking down what to measure and why. And one of the things that I love that it does is it talks about drawing a line in the sand, and we're going to come back to this later in the talk too. But our fourth element is it's not enough to say that this change will increase customer satisfaction. It will increase customer satisfaction by how much? You have to set a threshold. This is what makes your hypothesis either supported or refuted by an experiment. Because if you hypothesize that it's going to increase customer satisfaction by 10%, and it only increases customer satisfaction by 3%, guess what? Your hypothesis still fails. And what this does is it forces you to go through the exercise ahead of time to think about how much of an impact do I need for this to be worthwhile. And I'm going to give you 3 strategies for how to do that in just a few minutes. The fifth one is for how long. And this is a really common mistake that people make. They run an A/B test, and they run it until the results are statistically significant, if they're testing for significance, which they should be, or they run it for as long as they feel like. They go, I think a week is about enough time. And statistically, this is a nightmare. Don't do that, please. If you take anything away from this talk, just don't do that. Instead, we're going to talk about strategies for how to determine how long to run your test. Okay, so we're not going to just talk about the 5 components. Really, the key thing is, what's the relationship between the first 2? So remember, the first 2 is the change that we're making and the impact we expect it to have. So I'm rolling out this new design on my homepage, and I expect it to increase signups. Why? Why do I expect that to happen? I need to have a very clear reason. Either I've identified a usability problem, and my design is addressing that usability problem. It can't just be, some guy over there thought green was better than red. Here's why. Statistically, every A/B test you run has a % chance of being a false positive. Now, I know when I talk about statistics, a lot of people that aren't data analysts, even some data analysts, and almost anybody else in the room starts to glaze over and said, I haven't taken a stats class ever, or I did it my last year in college and I never went to class. That was me. That's fine. You don't have to understand the math. You just have to understand the concepts. And here's what you need to know. If you're calling statistical significance at a 95% confidence rate, your test has a 5% chance of being a false positive. That means it's going to look like version B outperformed version A, and there was likely no difference in reality, right? So it means your results show there was a difference, but there probably wasn't. So, okay, 1 is 5%, 1 out of 20 tests. No big deal, we can handle that, right? So we call our tests at 95%. Okay, but now fast forward. You've shifted your mindset, you're running a ton of experiments, it's an internet company, you're making hundreds of changes. Guess what? 1 in 20 is now really significant. Google and Facebook and Twitter, these companies of these sizes are running hundreds of tests at once. So false positives become a real concern. So this is something that, even if we don't understand the math behind it, conceptually we have to understand some of our tests are going to misinform us. The reason why the why matters is because we don't know why red is going to outperform green. And so we don't know if it could be a false positive, and we're not going to know why. But if we know that we identified a usability problem on our homepage and we think we fixed it and it outperformed, we're way less susceptible to that result being a false positive. There's other things we can do to reduce the chance of a false positive, like we can run our tests multiple times. And we can come back to some of those things. But the key here is you always want to connect the change to the why. And if you don't believe me and you're skeptical of this, I have a website for you. This is not in my slides, so feel free to write this down. Google spurious correlations. This is my favorite website ever because you don't need to understand statistics at all to understand what's happening here. They take really large data sets and they look for correlations. They find things that correlate at a high level of significance. And the things have nothing to do with each other. It's like, the faster I dig a hole in my backyard, the more people in Africa get malaria. No relations whatsoever. And it's because statistically, any comparison you do like that, you're going to get a small % chance that one of them is a false positive. So this is something that we have to be mindful of and aware of. And making sure there's a strong reason for why your change is going to drive the expected impact is one way to guard against that. It's also just good product management. All right, so we talked about the who and picking the right participant. So I told you this story about not testing with your whole audience. This happens a lot. So I talked about A/B testing. This happens a lot with usability studies. So I hear a lot of people give the advice of just do a quick and dirty usability study. Walk around the building, ask your fellow employees. Go to a coffee shop, buy them $5 gift cards for 5 minutes of their time. These strategies are fantastic if you're a broad, general-purpose consumer website. They're terrible if your product is for recruiters in healthcare, right? Because the odds of you running into healthcare recruiters at Starbucks, pretty slim. So this is where you need to be, no matter what your methods, whether it's an A/B test, whether it's a usability study, whether it's a customer development interview, you want to make sure that your participants are people who are like the people that are using your product. And I mean like in the right ways, so behaviorally similar. They use the same terminology, they have the same goals, they have the same motivations, they're trying to achieve the same tasks, not just they're both in their 30s and live in Silicon Valley. Okay, so let's come back to drawing a line in the sand. So this is where we're going to estimate how much impact we expect our change to have. So if I'm redesigning my homepage and I expect it to increase signups, I need to draw a line in the sand. And I need to say, I expect it to increase signups by 25%, or 10%, or 5%. The specific number doesn't matter. You're going to pick, the key is that you pick a number. And I'm going to give you 3 strategies for how to do this, but I want to tell you why we're doing this first. You're going to use this number to determine whether your hypothesis passes or fails. It's going to help you be a good scientist. This is going to sound silly, but here's what happens. Let's say that you decide you don't draw a line in the sand, and you roll out your change, and you get a 0.5% increase in your sign-up rate. Should you make that change? So most people would say, yes, any new signups is a good thing. Here's the problem with that. There are lots of other changes you could have made to your signup process that have a much bigger impact. So one of the things that we often forget when making product decisions is we make them as whether or not decisions. Should we roll out this design or not? And what we should be doing is saying, should we do this or this or this or this or this? And there's an infinite number of possibilities. And what's the most effective change that I can make that will have the biggest impact on my desired goal, which is to increase signups? And we need to get better at walking away from these really teeny tiny incremental changes and start looking for the changes that actually have a big impact. So that's one reason why we want to do this. The second reason why we want to do it is it's going to help us calculate for how long to run our test. And we'll come back to that in a second. So let's talk about strategies for how to do this. The first is to start with a baseline. So if we're talking about our homepage, we're looking at sign-up conversion rates. What are they today? If they're 80%, you're not going to see a 50% increase, right? If 80% of people are coming to your homepage and they're already signing up, no change you make is going to give you a 50% increase. If it's 10%, a 50% increase becomes totally feasible, right? So you can't set this threshold until you know what your baseline is today. So that's what you want to start with. Second thing that you can do is you can look at comparable changes. What other changes to your homepage have you made and how much of an impact did they have? So if you changed the language around your value proposition before, did it triple your signups? Did it double your signups? Did it not move the needle at all? What happened when you redesigned your signup form to make it more usable? This is where, as you build up your experimentation experience, you also build up a knowledge base of past experiments and how much impact they had. The third thing you want to look at is how big of an impact do I need this to have to warrant the engineering investment? Because remember, you should be running your experiments before you implement from an engineering standpoint. So these changes aren't free, right? It takes engineering time, it takes product time. We are going to incur technical debt to maintain it in the future. And so that 0.1% increase, sure, it might get you one more person to sign up out of every 100, but is that really worth it? Or should we be looking for that bigger impact change? All right, so the second reason why we're doing all of this, why we're calculating that threshold, is it's going to help us figure out when to stop our test. I think this is probably the most common mistake I see people make when they're brand new to A/B testing. right? They'll start an A/B test, they'll put it up there. Within an hour, they're looking at their results. The next day, they're looking at their results. 2 days later, they're looking at their results. And as soon as their favorite design is winning, they call it. And they go, my design won. But if you really look at your results every day, what you're going to notice is that your statistical significance is going to flip-flop. One day it's going to be significant, and the next day it's not. And that's because every single conversion is changing that factor. And again, if you just pick it when your favorite is winning, you're really making yourself susceptible to those false positives. Again, tests that look like winners that really aren't. And so the key here, there's some great tools on the internet. If you Google A/B test duration calculator, BWO has one out on the internet, visual website optimizer. And it's going to ask you things like what's your current conversion rate, so your baseline that you just calculated to figure out your line in the sand. It's going to ask you the percent increase you expect to change, that's your line in the sand. It's going to ask you how much traffic you have, and it's going to calculate how long you need to run the test. And you should be doing this on all of your quantitative tests. And then you really shouldn't peek at your results until that time period has passed. Now, I don't know any human being on the planet that doesn't peek at their results because it's really tempting. Just don't call it. Just don't consider the data valid until the time period has passed. Okay, staying on the theme of false positives. I'm sure many of you have had this experience. Let's test headlines for our new article. Or let's test subject lines for our new email. Well, why test 3 when we can test 25? Right? I can write 25 subject lines. Let's just see what one wins. So this is like throwing spaghetti at the wall. And what's the problem with this? The problem with this is if you test 25, you're virtually guaranteed to have a false positive. So how do you know which one's actually better and which one's a statistical anomaly? You don't, right? Now there are strategies you can do. You can run the test multiple times, and the odds that the same one is going to show up as a false positive gets reduced. So that's another thing that I recommend is that you run your tests not for more duration, but for the same duration a second time. So if your calculator tells you to run it for 3 days, run it for 3 days, look at your data, run it for 3 days again, look at a second set of data. But really the key is you're not going to have 25 different reasons why each headline is going to be better than the next, right? So you're much better off picking your 3 or 4 best headlines where you have a really strong reason, like one invokes curiosity and one it creates urgency, you know, all the tips around headline writing. And you're testing each one of those, so you have a really strong reason. All right, so another common mistake is people learn how to A/B test and they think that A/B testing will tell them all the answers. Or they read Cindy Alvarez's book, Lean Customer Development, also a phenomenal book, and they go, I can answer everything in a customer development interview. Here's the thing. Some questions are qualitative questions, some questions are quantitative questions. You need to learn which are which and apply the right methods to the right question. So this ties back to knowing what you're trying to learn. If you're trying to learn which design converts at a higher rate, that's probably an A/B test. If you want to learn why, that's probably a qualitative test. That's where something like usertesting.com is going to help you out. That's where actually doing some paper prototyping with real people is going to help you out. So another thing to keep in mind is to think about, is this a question around outcomes, like who's converting, what drives more conversions, or is it around more of those qualitative reasons? A lot of why questions, you should be in the qualitative arena, not quantitative. Okay, so we're going to come full circle. We're going to come all the way back to these 4 levels of product analysis. So let's stick with our home page example. We ran our A/B test, and we found that our new version failed miserably. Didn't cross our threshold. It not only didn't cross our threshold, it didn't even perform the same as our current homepage. What conclusions can we draw? So most people will conclude it didn't work, throw it out. There's a problem with that though. There's a lot of different components. If it includes a new value proposition, it's possible the value proposition didn't work and you can iterate on that. Or there might be a usability flaw in your sign-up form and people are just getting confused. Or it might be a performance issue, it loaded too slowly. The 4 levels of product analysis really help when looking at what conclusions can I draw from my experiment. And the way this works almost always is we always start with a design test, right? Because in order to test something, you have to have a specific design, specific email copy, a specific user interface mock-up, right? It's always at that design level. And when our hypothesis fails, we don't want to conclude that the feature failed or that the value proposition failed, because we don't know that. All we know is that that design failed. Now we could, if we're not confident in our value proposition, we could jump up to the value level and do some qualitative tests and start to understand, does our audience care about the value? Or if we're confident in our value proposition, we can say, you know what? I know that this is valuable to our audience. Let's try a different design. And we can stay at the design level. But if you test 5 or 6 different designs for the same feature and they all fail, you probably have to start to question, is this the right feature? Right? So if I'm working on a shopping site and I'm trying to get you to products faster, and the way that I do that is with search filters, and I try 5 different iterations on the design for search filters, and it's not getting you to products faster, I might want to change my mind and stop testing designs and start to look at what are other ways to get you to products faster. Do I add product recommendations? Do I improve my search relevance? Do I add a browse feature? These are all features, right? So I'm jumping from the design level, assuming my feature is right, up to the feature level. Okay, I just threw a whole bunch at you, and I want to make sure that we have lots of time for questions and answers. So I'm just going to end with a summary slide here of all the things that we ran through, because there's a lot of them. And I think Dan, in the introduction, said, I wrote a post about the 14 most common mistakes. I think I went through 8 of them. So there's more. So, you know, if there's someone in the room thinking they're a smarty pants and they've never made any of these mistakes, you can keep reading. But just to summarize, I think the key to remember is, in the lean principle way, always know what you're trying to learn. Start with a testable hypothesis. Have a clear reason for why your change is going to drive your expected impact. Always, that's a critical one. Choose the right participants. Draw a line in the sand. Don't stop your test whenever you want. Use that duration calculator. That's going to go a really long way. Don't test too many variables. Understand which methods are good for which methods, or which questions. And be really mindful about how you're drawing conclusions. And especially with conclusions, those 4 levels of product analysis can really help. And I know that I just threw a lot at you, so please jump in with questions. Yeah?
We have a mic, sorry. Mic on. Everybody here. There you go, Aiden. Thanks, Aiden.
Hey, Teresa. I was curious, I've often gotten hung up with the thinking that for every hypothesis you have to have a null hypothesis. I was felt encouraged that I think aside from the very beginning, you didn't really talk much about null hypothesis. Yeah. I was wondering if you could tell us your position on that, whether that's or maybe true science you do.
Yeah, so the idea of a null hypothesis comes from Karl Popper, so there's this whole realm of philosophy around what does it mean to know something. I'm going to try to stay out of that realm as much as possible, because that's right over there with statistics. But the idea is that when you're looking for support for a hypothesis, it's this idea of like, Nathan Taylor had a good example of this with the black swan, right? It's this idea that like, if every swan I've ever seen in my entire life is white, can I conclude there are no black swans? The answer to that question is no, right? Because as soon as I see a black swan, it doesn't matter how many white swans I saw before it, there are black swans. There's still the possibility there's a black swan. So Karl Popper argued that the only way that you can really know something is through disconfirming questions. So the only way that you can know that, you can't know that something doesn't exist in the sense of, like as soon as you see a black swan, that disconfirms that swans are only white, right? So a lot of the null hypothesis is wrapped up in this philosophy around how do we really know something. And a lot of that ties back to confirmation bias. Are you only looking for things that support what you're looking for? Even if you're trying to be a good scientist, you're going to be susceptible to that. So the concept of a null hypothesis is not just to start with your hypothesis, but to also have the null hypothesis, which is the opposite. And that's to encourage you to look for evidence for both. And if I understand it correctly, people are actually trying to prove their null hypothesis as a way of supporting or refuting their actual hypothesis. I think if you were a scientist and or all of this makes perfect sense for you, feel free to adopt that. Most of the people that I'm working with, and I assume it includes a lot of you in the room, are already struggling with just the basic concepts. And just defining a hypothesis with the 5 components is a lot harder than it looks. So I look at it as, let's take baby steps in the right direction. Maybe next year you'll hear me talk about null hypotheses. Somebody who knows more about that want to add to that? All right.
Any other question?
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing all these tips. A lot of it resonates with some of the experiences I've had, but some of the things I've reflected on is I've run a number of experiments and learned some things along the way, but sometimes it's harder to also have that crystal clear vision. I've had the blessing or curse of having like a big sort of blue sky challenge, like go find that next big product opportunity for our business. And sometimes just taking like these elements is not necessarily enough to know like, well, what's that North Star? And if I learn something that's not quite supported by the data, what area am I going to explore next? So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the importance of vision and ways you've seen that done well, and maybe even another question like when you see teams that are exploring, really new areas, how do you know if they're on the right track? How would you evaluate their progress? How would you sort of manage their work?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this comes from a few assumptions that I think aren't true. And that's that experimentation has to be incremental, and that it's always quantitative A/B testing. And I think that if we look back at the 4 levels of analysis, when we're talking about like blue ocean strategy, brand new innovative things that have never been done before, you still need to experiment and build support for your ideas. And a lot of that is at this top level, this value proposition. Am I solving a problem that's worth solving? Does this problem actually exist for anybody? And is it a big enough problem that they're ever going to pay me money to solve it for them? And then once you've, I almost said validated, see it's everywhere. Once you've built support for that, then you want to move on to that next level of, okay, there's lots of ways that I can do this. And different companies, this is where companies differentiate. So an example that I often use is the phones in your pockets. So probably there's 40% of you on Android and 40% of you on iOS and the rest of you are weird. And we can have ideological wars about which ones are better, but if you look at Apple and you look at Google, they have very different philosophies around how to build phones. So the value proposition is very similar, right? They have a computer in your pocket, it does anything and everything for you. But on Apple's case, the way that they're going to do that is through a closed system where they control everything. And the way that Google is going to do that is through an open system with lots and lots of choices, lots of hardware choices, lots of apps. So this is where you could imagine a new innovative phone company coming in with a whole different approach. And it doesn't mean that they can't experiment or that what they're doing is necessarily incremental. It just means their experimentation might be a level higher. What's the problem that they're solving? Is it worth solving? What's my company's view on how to do it? That's where I think vision really comes in. A lot of it is tied up in that value proposition. And a lot of it is tied up into how they deliver on that value proposition. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Over here.
So I usually think statistical methods are kind of dangerous because it's very easy to mess up, like what you're talking about, maybe sampling errors or confounding variables between your independent, dependent variable and hypothesis. So sometimes you just get one tiny little thing wrong in your design, and all your research effort is all wasted. So I'm working on an early stage startup, and we tend to use a lot of more qualitative methods. user interviews or user studies, and trying to get more valid data instead of getting very reliable data from the statistical methods. So from the lean startup thought, have what's your experience with rather than using statistical method, but interviews or trying to get like very few samples,
Yeah.
but getting data from that type?
Yeah, so I started with my definition of experimentation is really broad. I think it includes interviews, it includes usability studies, it includes A/B tests, it includes literally sitting down with somebody with a paper prototype, like anything that you're doing to learn about your customer or your user and what's working and what's not working, I think should be approached from a scientific perspective, whether it's quantitative or not, right? So in your qualitative interviews, you may not be getting quantitative data, but you should still be building support or refuting a hypothesis. That's the nature of that's the whole point of customer development, right? Is you're working through, especially paired with a business model canvas, you're working through your hypotheses, trying to build support for them or iterating on them. And I think with qualitative methods, it's actually just as important to know ahead of time what's your line in the sand. In that case, we're not talking about statistical significance. So you might say, I'm going to run a usability study with 5 people, not enough for statistical significance. But in order for me to know that this design is good, I need 4 out of 5 of them to complete some task within some time frame. And the benefit of doing that before you run the study is because after the fact, if you don't do that, as long as somebody completed the task, you're going to come up with reasons why other people had problems. Because the more that we invest in our ideas, whether it's engineering or design or product, the more committed we become to them. And that's why we become susceptible to confirmation bias. So all the things that I talked about, even though a lot of my examples were quantitative, they do apply on the qualitative side. You still want to look at what's your line in the sand. How are you going to know? A good question to ask yourself before you do your interviews, before you do your study, how will I know if this hypothesis passes or if it fails? And to define that up front. Does that help?
Yeah, like, I think what they call it, operationalize.
Yeah. I mean, that's the academic research term for it. Know your variables, operationalize them. We can get into that afterwards. Back here? Oh.
Thank you, Teresa. So I think, I have a good idea of how we would test for either qualitative or quantitative for like feature design.
Mm-hmm.
But can you talk about examples of like, actual examples of like value tests and, how you carry out value tests and how you know that you've actually seen it? Because I feel like that's really hard.
Yeah. So you touched on something that came up over here. I want to just clarify this before I answer your specific question. Statistics and data are never going to tell you the answers. We're all human beings and we all have to use judgment. So no matter what experiments you run, even in like physics and biology and chemistry, it's not like you just infinitely run experiments and you suddenly get the answer, right? Science is a combination of insight and experiments. And that's going to be the case in the product world. So tests at the value level tend to be qualitative. Not always, right? The MVP sign-up page, add your email address, that can be a value proposition test. But for the most part, at the value proposition level, you want a little bit more rich context. So I have a blog post coming out tomorrow. I'll give you a sneak preview because it's a good example of this, where I talk about, let's say that I notice a lot of people on their about pages on their blogs are including testimonials. And I go, I wonder if that would increase my email subscription rate. By the way, here's my info. You all should have subscribed to my blog. Little shameless plug. Okay, so let's say that I'm trying to test that, right? Like, why would testimonials are a feature? What's the value that they're offering? And I go, okay, well, maybe the value of a testimonial is its social proof. And I want to know if product managers care about social proof. So that I could do through a customer development interview. I could interview you and I could say, hey, when was the last time you subscribed to a blog? Tell me about it. How'd you find it? Why did you choose to subscribe? And if in your answers you talk about things like 5 people recommended it, or Hiten Shah gave a testimonial and I really respect his perspective, I'm starting to get some clues that, hey, social proof matters to my audience. Am I ever going to get a black and white answer that yes, this absolutely matters? No. And this is something that Cindy Alvarez writes about in Lean Customer Development, where she does an amazing job of. A lot of people will be very polite and smile and nod and tell you, yes, that sounds like a great idea. So you want to be really careful that you ask your questions indirectly. You want them to suggest what you're looking for, not you asking for it. And you want to look for that emotion behind it. So are they enthusiastically saying, you know what, I ran into Dan, he was raving about this blog, I knew I had to go check it out. Or where they're saying, well, I went to a conference and there was 8 blogs listed and I subscribed to all 8 of them, right? So that's where judgment is always going to come into play. There was one back here. Yeah?
Following up on that conversation with the Blue Sky brainstorm and questions about value proposition, how do you define the how much and how long for those kind of hypotheses?
Yeah, so just building on that same example, if I'm going to interview people about how they find blogs and what encourages them to subscribe, I probably want to define things like I'm going to talk to 10 product managers and I want to see at least 5 of them care about social proof. And if I don't see that, maybe I should invest my time somewhere else. And again, the 5 doesn't matter, maybe it's 3, right? That's me making a judgment based on traffic to my about page, how many people subscribe, what's my baseline, what other changes have I made to that page? Does it move it from 3 to 4? Does it move it from 3 to 7? Right? So that's where those strategies for the how much still apply in the qualitative test.
Go back to the room. So I had a quick question for you. Can you speak a little bit about how do you bring this mindset of using data to drive decision making in product development and combating that hey, I got a gut feel and that's what we got to go with, and there's like that mindset.
Yeah.
I'm right and I have a reason. I think I know I'm right.
Yeah, so there's a question that I ask a lot when working with people, is what assumptions are you making that have to be true for this idea to work? So if you fall in love with your idea, that's great, I'm going to get behind you. Let's do this idea, this sounds perfect. Just humor me for a second. What has to be true for this idea to work, right? And that's a very disarming question for people, because first of all, you're not saying, your idea sucks, I don't want to do it, that's just your opinion. That's not what the data says. You're actually sitting on their side of the table and saying, all right, let's figure out how to make this work. What has to be true for that idea to work? And the answer to that question is what you want to test. And so that's where you can say, okay, this looks like a great idea, but these things have to be true. How about if we go out and look for whether those things are true before we make that investment? And oftentimes that works. But there will always be times where, whether it's the person above you in the hierarchy, or it's a founder, or it's a CEO, and they just want it done their way, it takes time. Dan mentioned at the beginning that I'm getting a master's in learning and organizational change. It's because I fundamentally believe that product management is a change management process. And that to go from, I have an opinion, I'm right, to let's do what the data says, is an individual and an organizational change management process. And I think product managers and designers and engineers and founders need to be really aware of that and respect that. So it can be hard. Yeah?
Jay's back.
I'll ask another one. What if your executive's favorite metric of success is revenue you're making right now? Why are we wasting time talking about problems?
Yeah. I have a lot of first-hand experience with this situation.
So I wasn't just making it up.
Yeah. I feel like it's a really common problem. The approach that I take is I try to align, as a product person, I try to look at how can my company that I work at, or that I'm working for now as a consultant, make money when the user or the customer has success. So that sounds obvious, but that's not how most companies are set up, right? So for example, let's take Craigslist, great product, great company, I'm not going to diss on them, except for the fact that they make money in a way that doesn't have anything to do with when the customer has success. So for example, I can post an ad on Craigslist But my success is if I'm trying to sell my stereo, my success is when I sold the stereo, not when I posted the ad. But Craigslist is making money when they posted the ad. So what that does, now Craigslist is a pretty, like, not evil company, because they're a good example in that I'm not really picking on them, and a terrible example in that because I'm picking on them. But it could incentivize them, and I'm sure you guys work in organizations where you've seen this, where everyone in the company is optimizing around, we need more postings. But more postings isn't necessarily creating value for anybody. It's the exchange of goods or the exchange of services that's actually creating value for someone. The challenge there, measuring that, is significantly harder than measuring more postings. So as a product person, I try to move any organization I'm working with to measuring further down that funnel so that the business metric can continue to be revenue, but I'm aligning what's good for the user and the customer with that revenue event. And again, that's a change management process, and it takes a very long time. But again, if we're moving in the right direction, eventually we get there, right?
How long?
I mean, my last company, it took about 15 months, and then I left because it didn't fix the problem. But we did, but to be fair, we did, in a period of 15 months, we went from new registrations as our measure of success, which registrations mean nothing, all the way to, did you find a job? It was a job board. And we measured success around, did you actually get hired, or did you make a hire? That's a huge shift to make in only 15 months. Unfortunately, it didn't change behavior around revenue, right? So there were still lots of other things we sold where money was made that had nothing to do with those things happening. Maybe if I'd stayed longer, we would have made more progress. But I lost faith that that would happen, so I left. Right?
Can I ask another question?
I don't know, you guys okay with him asking another question?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
So you talked about product management as a change management role. I'm guessing, though, that maybe the change management skills might be harder than, like, say, getting your head around the logic of running an experiment. And I don't know if you agree with that or not, but what are some great tips you have for doing effective lean change management?
Yeah. So first of all, there's nothing logical about change management. Change management is entirely the messy human emotion side of things. Tips on change management, maybe Dan will invite me back and I'll do another talk. That's a whole another hour plus. The change management literature is all over the place. There's sort of the consultant world, which is John Cotter. He wrote The Heart of Change. You might have heard some of his stuff. He argues, start with a burning platform, go for small wins, build a coalition. It's very consultancy speak tips. I think the better change management stuff is really rooted in psychology and why psychologically it's hard for us to change. And there's a guy, William Bridges, that wrote, the title of his book has the name Transitions in it. I can't remember what the title of it is. But if you Google William Bridges, you'll find this book. I actually like his model much better. But this, again, it really is a question that I could spend an hour answering. So maybe afterwards I can share some resources. I do encourage everybody that works at startups or builds internet products to learn a little bit about change management. Because almost everything, we see it in the Facebook news feed debacle from years ago when 1 million people hated Facebook when there was only 3 million people on Facebook. And then again with timeline, right? This is poor change management. They completely disrupted their user base with product changes. So just having an awareness, they've gotten much better at it, by the way, but having an awareness of that really helps. Here?
You mentioned the possibility of choosing to rerun your experiments.
Yeah.
To see if you can confirm the results, and obviously there can be some costs to that as well, just in terms of not locking a win or exposing users to a worse treatment again, or just creating noise that can affect the false positives in your other experiments you have running. So what are some of the things that you look at when considering whether to rerun experiments?
Some of it has to do with how strong the why is between the change and the expected impact. If I have a really strong why and the results are what I expected, maybe I'm less skeptical of the results. That's a little bit of a slippery slope because I'm opening up myself to some bias there. Some of it is the duration of the test. If it takes an hour to run the test because I have a high traffic site, there's virtually no cost of running it a second time. Even companies with medium-sized traffic, running it for a day is usually enough, and running it for a second day, not that big of a burden. If we're talking about tests that take 30 days to figure out, it gets a lot harder. I would maybe not do it as an A/B test and look at, is there a better way to get my answer? And this is where I really encourage people. Experimentation is a big toolbox. There's lots of methods. So if one method isn't working, or you can't get data fast enough, try another one. And you can mix and match, right? If you have an A/B test where it looks like this is a winner, and you did some usability studies and got some qualitative feedback, and it looks like it is a winner, this, in the academic world, people triangulate research to know anything, right? Somebody does a qualitative study, somebody else does a quantitative study, someone else looks at it a different way. All three have similar conclusions. We have a lot more confidence in that conclusion than if any single study found that result. We can do the same in our own work at a much smaller scale.
Very good time. If there's one more question, and then, I'm sure Teresa will hang out with it and do more questions. Does anyone else got a question? In the back.
How do you convince engineers that your results are good and that that is what the user wants and says and does?
Yeah. Okay, so I get a lot of questions about how do you work with UX, how do you work with product, how do you work with engineering, how do you get everybody on board with experimentation? And I think the answer to 99% of these problems are work together, right? Don't run your experiment without help from engineering. Most of the time, you're going to need engineering's help to get the data anyway. And oftentimes, an engineer is going to help you with the experiment design. They're going to have buy-in. What's your role? Are you in product or UX?
I'm in product, but I also understand engineering, and oftentimes I run the qualitative tests, and those are much harder to run by engineers because they often look for numbers and percentages.
Yeah, so a few things. Invite them to observe. It's really hard to ignore a problem when you watch a user express pain, right? Anybody who's observed qualitative research, it's really hard to ignore what you hear, especially if it happens over and over again. This is where usertesting.com is, I think, and I know they're a sponsor, but I really do believe this, completely revolutionizing user testing. Because you can send those videos to whoever needs to see them, and you can get them in a day. And start earlier than that. So definitely share the interviews with them, but start earlier than that. Start with them, having a conversation with them around what would you need to see? What do we collectively need to learn to answer this question? So what you might need to learn to answer that question might be different from what your engineer needs to learn, but that's where you're all on the same team, right? So I get questions like, how many usability participants do we need to get valid results? Depends on who you talk to. Jacob Nielsen, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, said only 5 because you stopped getting data back. But if you work at an organization where they think 20 is required to get valid results, you better go get 20, right? So this is where your context matters in terms of how you run your tests.
All right, cool. Well, let's thank Teresa for an awesome talk. I would just add in the last one, I think you're right about try to get them to come, because for some reason, when the product manager is telling them, yeah, no, this is what the user did, no, this really happened, they just don't quite believe you as much as if they see it with their own eyes. Engineers are skeptical at times. And I do know they like data and they like numbers, but if you're doing qualitative, there's not that statistical significance, but seeing it firsthand definitely is awesome. And then, thanks for an awesome talk, Teresa. I love what you said also about the build, measure, learn shouldn't start with build. And I'm actually writing a book, and I kind of redrew that. This is my version of it, basically. So I totally agree with you. I think it's more like hypothesize, design, test, learn, right? And Stephen Cohen, who spoke here last month, exactly, it's all about his product validate. It's all about validate, use the word validate, but like test before you code. Like the whole point is to basically, before you spend those valuable resources, validate what you're doing. So anyway.